The rifle crack echoed through the canyon like thunder, and Kenneth Mitchell dropped face first into the snow, crimson spreading beneath him like spilled wine. Dorothy Reyes worked the bolt with practiced precision, brass cartridge spinning through the frigid air as she racked her next target through the scope. Three more men scrambled for cover behind the overturned wagon, their confident assault dissolving into desperate survival. She had warned them, told them exactly what would happen if they came for her land, her horses, her life. They laughed then, 5 men against one grieving widow. Now Kenneth lay still in the snow, and the others were learning what Dorothy Reyes really was beneath the calloused hands and silver-streaked hair. Ralph Garcia pressed himself against the wagon wheel, breathing hard. His expensive coat was torn, his arrogance replaced by the cold understanding that they had made a terrible mistake. The woman they thought was easy prey had turned their hunting ground into a killing field, and every path through these mountains led to a trap she had already set. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. This is going to be one hell of a ride. The story began 3 weeks earlier on a morning when frost painted the cabin windows white and Dorothy Reyes woke to silence where there should have been the soft nickering of horses. She pulled on worn boots and stepped onto the porch, breath misting in the mountain air. The corral gate hung open, fresh tracks leading down toward the valley. Someone had taken Thunder, her prize stallion, the black horse that had been her husband Samuel's last gift before the fever took him. Dorothy knelt beside the tracks, reading the story written in churned earth and broken snow. 5 horses, shod with new iron. Men who rode with purpose but without skill, leaving a trail a child could follow. They had come in the night, cut the fence, and led Thunder away like he was theirs to take. Her fingers traced the hoof prints, muscle memory from another life stirring beneath the widow's grief. For Samuel, before this cabin, before she chose peace over the badge, Dorothy Reyes had been something else entirely. Deputy United States Marshal Dorothy Reyes, the woman who tracked the Dalton gang through 3 territories and brought them in alive. The woman who could read sign like scripture and shoot the wings off a fly at 200 yards. She had buried that woman with Samuel, choosing love over law, choosing a quiet life in these mountains over the violence that had defined her for 20 years. But as she studied the tracks leading away from her home, Dorothy felt something cold and familiar settling in her chest. Some things should not be taken. Thunder was one of them. The trail led down through pine stands heavy with snow, past the creek where ice formed crystal bridges between the banks. Dorothy followed on foot, moving silent as smoke between the trees. The men had made camp 5 miles down valley, confident in their theft, careless with their fire. She counted them from the ridge above. 5 men, well armed, laughing as they passed a bottle around their campfire. Thunder stood hobbled nearby, ears pricked forward, sensing her presence even at this distance. The stallion had been born on this mountain, raised from a colt in her hands. He knew her scent, her voice, the way she moved through his world. Dorothy smiled grimly. These fools had stolen more than a horse. They had taken the last piece of Samuel she had left. She studied the men through the scope of Samuel's old Sharps rifle, reading their faces, their weapons, their casual cruelty. The leader was a big man with silver hair and expensive clothes, clearly not used to sleeping rough. Kenneth Mitchell, she realized, recognizing him from wanted posters that had crossed her desk years ago. A cattle rustler turned land grabber, working his way north from Texas with a crew of hired guns. Dorothy had heard rumors in town. Mitchell was buying up land around the valley, making offers that were really threats. Those who refused to sell found their livestock missing, their barns burned, their families threatened. The territorial marshal was 3 days' ride away, and Mitchell knew it. He operated with impunity, taking what he wanted, when he wanted it. But he had never tried to take something from Dorothy Reyes. She watched them for hours, cataloging their weapons, their habits, the way they moved around camp. Professional criminals, but overconfident. They saw an isolated valley, a woman alone, easy pickings. They had no idea what they had awakened. As the sun set behind the peaks, Dorothy made her way back to the cabin. In the root cellar, behind sacks of potatoes and preserved meat, she found the oiled leather case she had not opened in 3 years. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth, lay her marshal's badge and the tools of her former trade. A Colt 45 with custom grips, worn smooth by her hand. Boxes of ammunition she had loaded herself, each cartridge precise as a prayer. Maps of the territory marked with her own notations, hideouts, and trails known only to her. She cleaned the Colt by lamplight, muscle memory guiding her hands through the familiar ritual. Oil on moving parts, cloth through the barrel, checking the action until it was smooth as silk. The weight felt right in her hand, balanced and deadly. She had not forgotten how to use it, would never forget. The next morning, Dorothy rode out on Sage, her gray mare, following the trail Mitchell's men had left. But she was not pursuing them as a grieving widow seeking her stolen horse. She was hunting them as Marshal Dorothy Reyes, and that made all the difference. The tracks led south toward Copper Creek, where Mitchell had set up a temporary camp while he worked the valley. Dorothy knew every ridge, every canyon, every game trail in these mountains. She had ridden them for 3 years as Samuel's wife, but before that she had mapped them as a marshal tracking fugitives. The land itself was her ally, and Mitchell's men were strangers walking into her domain. She found their main camp just before noon, hidden in a box canyon where they felt safe from observation. 8 men now, reinforcements having arrived in the night. They had Thunder tied with the other horses, the stallion's coat gleaming black against the snow. Seeing him captive made something cold and hard settle in Dorothy's chest. Kenneth Mitchell stood near the fire, studying a map spread on a wooden crate. Even at distance, Dorothy could see the red marks indicating properties he intended to acquire. Her own land was circled in thick red ink. She settled into position on the canyon rim, Sharp's rifle steady on its bipod. 250 yards, slight crosswind from the west, target unaware. An easy shot, but Dorothy Reyes had not become a legend by taking easy shots. She wanted Mitchell to know who had beaten him, wanted him to understand the magnitude of his mistake before she ended it. Dorothy climbed down from the rim and walked into their camp. The sentries never saw her coming. She moved like smoke through the trees, using every shadow, every fold in the ground. 20 years of tracking desperate men had taught her how to become invisible, how to appear where enemies least expected. She was 10 feet from the fire before Kenneth Mitchell looked up from his map and saw death walking toward him. "Mitchell," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. The camp went silent. 8 men reached for weapons, but something in Dorothy's stance, the way she stood balanced and ready, made them hesitate. She wore no badge, carried no obvious threat, but every professional in that camp recognized another professional when they saw one. "You took something that belongs to me," Dorothy continued, her eyes never leaving Mitchell's face. "I want it back." Mitchell laughed, but the sound was forced, uncertain. "You talking about that horse, lady? He is mine now, bought and paid for." "You did not buy him," Dorothy said. "You stole him." "There is a difference." Kenneth Mitchell studied her more carefully, taking in the worn leather coat, the gray-streaked hair, the calloused hands of a woman who worked hard for her living. But something about her eyes, the way she held herself, made him uneasy. "Who are you, lady? I am the woman you should not have crossed." One of Mitchell's men, a thin gunfighter named Charles Lopez, laughed harshly. "Boss, she is just some widow trying to scare us. What is one woman going to do against all of us?" Dorothy turned her attention to Lopez, studying him with the calm assessment of a professional evaluating a target. "You are Charles Lopez, wanted in New Mexico for murder. $500 bounty, dead or alive." Lopez went pale. "How do you know that?" "Because I used to hunt men like you for a living." The camp had gone completely quiet now, tension crackling between the men like electricity before a storm. Dorothy could see understanding dawning in Mitchell's eyes, recognition of something he should have seen earlier. "You are her," Mitchell said slowly. "Dorothy Reyes, the marshal who brought in the Dalton gang." "Former marshal," Dorothy corrected. "I retired when I married, but some skills do not fade." She let her coat fall open, revealing the Colt at her hip. The movement was casual, unthreatening, but every man in camp saw the worn grips, the way the holster was positioned for a fast draw. This was not some widow's protection piece. This was the tool of a professional killer. "I want my horse," Dorothy said. "You can give him to me, or I can take him. Your choice." Mitchell's hand drifted toward his own weapon, but Dorothy shook her head slightly. "Do not," she said quietly. You are not fast enough. The standoff stretched like a taut wire, 8 armed men facing one woman who stood calm as stone in their midst. Dorothy could see the calculations running through Mitchell's mind. He had heard the stories, knew her reputation. The marshal who never missed, who could track a ghost through solid rock, who had brought in more wanted men than any lawman in the territory. But she was one woman, and he had 8 guns. Mitchell made his choice. He went for his weapon, and Dorothy moved. The Colt appeared in her hand like magic, clearing leather and firing before Mitchell's gun was halfway drawn. The shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. Professional, precise, calculated to disable rather than kill. The other men scrambled for cover, but Dorothy was already moving, using their confusion and the terrain to her advantage. She rolled behind a fallen log as bullets whined overhead, then came up firing. Charles Lopez screamed. Her second shot shattered his gun hand, sending his pistol spinning away into the snow. 2 down, 6 to go. Dorothy melted back into the trees, leaving the men shouting and cursing around their ruined camp. She had made her point, demonstrated what they were facing. Now came the real hunt. She knew these mountains like her own heartbeat, every game trail and hidden passage. The men would try to pursue her, but they were strangers here, dependent on marked trails and obvious routes. Dorothy could move through country they could not even see, appear where they least expected, strike and vanish like a ghost. The first man died an hour later, Ralph Garcia taking point as they tried to follow her trail. Dorothy's shot came from 300 yards, the Sharp's rifle speaking with authority across the canyon. Garcia dropped without a sound, and the others dove for cover that was not there. She had chosen the killing ground carefully, a narrow defile where they could not spread out, could not use their numbers. From her position on the rim, she commanded every approach. They were trapped, and they knew it. Kenneth Mitchell, his arm in a makeshift sling, screamed orders at his remaining men. Find her. Kill her. But his voice carried the edge of panic now. The confident predator had become prey, and the taste of it was bitter in his mouth. The second man fell trying to scale the canyon wall, thinking he could reach Dorothy's position. Carl Lee made it halfway up before her rifle found him, the heavy bullet punching through his chest and dropping him back to the rocks below. The sound echoed through the canyon like judgment. 4 men left, huddled behind inadequate cover, their bravado evaporating in the face of professional death. Dorothy called down to them, her voice carrying clearly in the thin air. This ends when you return my horse and leave my valley. Keep fighting, and you all die here. Mitchell's response was a string of curses and wild shots fired at shadows. Dorothy smiled grimly. Fear was making him stupid, and stupid men made mistakes. She waited until full dark, then began to move. Night was her ally, darkness a cloak she had worn for 20 years of hunting. The remaining men had built up their fire, seeking comfort in light, but the flames only served to blind them to the shadows beyond. Dorothy came for them like winter wind, silent and inevitable. The third man died, never knowing she was there. Ryan Hill standing guard while the others huddled around the fire. Dorothy's knife took him from behind, quick and quiet, and she was gone before his body hit the ground. When the others found him an hour later, they knew death was walking among them. 2 left now, besides Mitchell. Professional killers reduced to frightened men jumping at shadows. Dorothy could have finished it then, could have ended them all in the darkness. But she wanted Mitchell to understand completely, wanted him to know the depth of his error. She waited until dawn. Kenneth Mitchell looked like he had aged 10 years in one night. His expensive clothes were torn and dirty, his face haggard with exhaustion and fear. Beside him crouched his last man, a hard case named Carl Lee, who kept his rifle trained on the canyon rim, searching for targets that were not there. The morning sun painted the snow crimson, and Mitchell finally understood the trap he had walked into. This was not random violence, not the desperate flailing of a grieving widow. This was execution, methodical and professional, carried out by someone who had forgotten more about killing than he had ever learned. Dorothy appeared on the canyon rim like a figure from nightmare, silhouetted against the morning sky. The Sharp's rifle was steady in her hands, trained down at the 2 survivors. Last chance, Mitchell, she called. My horse for your life. Mitchell's response was to grab his rifle and fire wildly at her position. The shots went wide, panic destroying his aim. Dorothy did not even flinch. Carl Lee was smarter. He threw down his weapon and raised his hands. "I am done," he shouted. "This is not my fight anymore." Dorothy nodded. "Walk away. Do not come back." Carl Lee did not need to be told twice. He gathered his gear and headed for the canyon mouth, moving fast but not running. He knew better than to trigger a predator's chase instinct. That left Kenneth Mitchell alone with his stolen horse and his mounting terror. Dorothy climbed down from the rim, moving with the fluid grace of a natural hunter. Mitchell tracked her with his rifle, but his hands were shaking now, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. "You killed my men," he said, his voice cracking. "You brought killers to my valley," Dorothy replied calmly. "I treated them as they deserved." She was 50 yards away now, well within rifle range, but Mitchell could not seem to pull the trigger. Something about her steady advance, the way she moved without fear or haste, paralyzed him. This was not how it was supposed to go. He was Kenneth Mitchell, the man who took what he wanted, who bent others to his will through fear and violence. But Dorothy Reyes had never bent to anyone. 40 yards, 30. Mitchell's rifle wavered, his breathing ragged. Dorothy's hand rested casually on her Colt, ready but not threatening. She knew she had already won. Had known it from the moment she walked into his camp. 20 yards. Mitchell finally found his courage, or his desperation. He swung the rifle toward Dorothy and fired. The shot went high, panic destroying his aim. Dorothy's Colt cleared leather in a smooth draw that was pure poetry, muscle memory, and 20 years of practice combining in one fluid motion. The shot took Mitchell's center mass, dropping him to his knees in the snow. He looked down at the spreading crimson on his shirt, then up at Dorothy with something like wonder in his eyes. "Who are you?" he whispered. "I am Dorothy Reyes," she said quietly, "and you should have left my horse alone." Kenneth Mitchell fell forward into the snow and did not move again. Dorothy holstered her weapon and walked to where Thunder stood tied with the other horses. The stallion nickered softly as she approached, pressing his muzzle against her hand. She untied his lead rope and swung up onto his bare back, feeling the familiar strength beneath her. The ride back to her cabin took 2 hours, Thunder moving with the sure-footed grace of a horse returning home. Dorothy did not look back at the canyon where 5 men lay dead in the snow. Justice had been served, as clean and final as winter itself. Word of the canyon fight spread through the valley like wildfire. Carl Lee, the only survivor, told his story in every saloon and trading post between Copper Creek and the territorial capital. How Kenneth Mitchell and his crew had tried to steal a horse from a quiet widow, only to discover they had awakened something terrible. How Dorothy Reyes, the legendary marshal, had emerged from retirement to deliver justice with her own hands. Some said Carl Lee was drunk, spinning tall tales to buy whiskey. Others remembered the old stories, the wanted posters that bore Dorothy's name, the reputation that had made hardened criminals surrender rather than face her in a fight. Those who knew looked toward the mountains with new respect, understanding that something had changed in their quiet valley. Dorothy returned to her daily routine as if nothing had happened. She fed her horses, mended fences, chopped wood for the coming winter. But the badge and gun remained within easy reach, no longer hidden in the root cellar. The widow's mask had slipped, revealing the steel beneath. 3 days after the canyon fight, a rider approached her cabin. Dorothy watched from the porch as Sheriff Thomas Wade dismounted, his badge catching the morning sun. She knew Wade by reputation, a good man trying to keep order in a territory too large for any one lawman to control. "Dorothy," Wade said, touching his hat brim, "mind if we talk?" She gestured to the porch steps, and Wade settled himself carefully, keeping his hands visible. He had heard the stories, knew what kind of woman he was dealing with. "Carl Lee came to see me," Wade said. "Told me quite a story about what happened up in the canyon. I imagine he did." Wade studied her face, looking for some sign of the killer Carl Lee had described. All he saw was a weathered woman in her 40s, silver threading through dark hair, hands that showed the calluses of hard work. But her eyes were steady, calm, and Wade had seen enough killers to recognize the look. 5 men dead, Dorothy. That is a lot of blood, even for scum like Mitchell's crew. They came to my land uninvited, Dorothy said quietly. Took what was mine. I asked politely for its return. Wade almost smiled. Carl Lee said you shot Mitchell's gun hand clean off before he could clear leather. Dorothy shrugged. I was aiming for his chest. Must be getting rusty. That made Wade laugh despite himself. 20 years ago, Dorothy Reyes had been the most feared marshal in the territory. Criminals would surrender to other lawmen rather than risk facing her. She had never lost a fight, never failed to bring in her men. Why did you quit, Dorothy? Wade asked. You were the best we had. I fell in love, she said simply. Samuel showed me there was more to life than hunting men through the wilderness. Wade nodded, understanding. He had seen too many good lawmen burn out, consumed by the violence they fought against. Dorothy had found a way out, chosen love over law, peace over the badge. But now Samuel was gone, and the killer had emerged from retirement. The territorial governor wants to offer you a job, Wade said. Deputy Marshal, working directly under my authority. The territory needs someone with your skills. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, watching Thunder graze in the corral. The stallion moved with easy grace, black coat gleaming in the sun. He was home, safe, where he belonged. I retired for a reason, Sheriff. I chose this life, and now I protect what is mine. Wade stood, understanding that the conversation was over. Dorothy Reyes had made her choice, drawn her line in the mountain soil. She would not hunt for badges or bounties anymore, would not ride the long trails in pursuit of desperate men. But anyone who threatened her valley, her horses, her chosen life, would learn what Kenneth Mitchell had learned in that frozen canyon. Wade mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Dorothy alone on her porch. She sat in the morning sun, listening to the wind through the pines, the soft sounds of horses moving in their pasture. This was peace, the life she had chosen, the life Samuel had shown her was possible. But the colt remained at her hip, and the badge lay within easy reach. That evening, as Dorothy fed her horses and secured the cabin for night, she noticed fresh tracks near the creek. Not deer or elk, but shod horses moving carefully through the trees. Someone was watching her, sir, studying her routine, learning her habits. Dorothy smiled grimly. Word of the canyon fight had spread, but apparently not far enough. Someone else was making the same mistake Kenneth Mitchell had made. She finished her chores and went inside, but did not light the usual lamp. Instead, she moved through the darkened cabin with the silent skill of a hunter, checking sight lines, preparing fields of fire. If they wanted to come for her in the night, she would be ready. But the attack did not come that night or the next. Whoever was out there was more careful than Mitchell, more patient. They were taking time to study their target, to plan their approach. Dorothy approved. It showed they had learned something from Mitchell's fate. But patience was a game two could play, and Dorothy Reyes had been playing it longer than most. On the fourth night, they finally came. Dorothy heard them long before they reached the cabin, boots crunching through snow, whispered voices carrying on the wind. 4 men, moving with military precision through the trees. These were not cattle rustlers or common thieves, these were professionals. She slipped out the west door and into the darkness, becoming one with the shadows. The Sharp's rifle was slung across her back, the Colt ready in her hand. Let them come to her cabin, let them find it empty. She would be waiting. The men approached from 3 directions, coordinating their movements with hand signals. Dorothy watched from the tree line, reading their tactics, their weapons, their intentions. They wore dark clothes and moved with the fluid grace of soldiers. But something about their equipment suggested they were not military. Corporate security, she realized. Hired guns working for someone with deep pockets and professional standards. Someone who had learned from Mitchell's mistakes. The team leader was a tall man with graying hair and cold eyes. Dorothy recognized the type, a former soldier turned mercenary, the kind of man who sold his skills to the highest bidder. He directed his team with quiet efficiency, surrounding the cabin, cutting off escape routes. But Dorothy was not in the cabin. She was behind them, moving like smoke through the trees. 20 years of hunting had taught her how to become invisible, how to appear where enemies least expected. She chose her target carefully, the man covering the rear approach, isolated from his teammates. The knife took him silently, and Dorothy dragged his body into the shadows before his absence could be noticed. 3 left, their formation compromised, their rear guard eliminated. She circled wide, using the terrain to mask her movement. The second man died as he tried to peer through the cabin windows, Dorothy's shot from the darkness taking him clean. The sound echoed through the valley, and the remaining two mercenaries went to ground. But going to ground in Dorothy's valley was like hiding in her living room. She knew every rock, every tree, every fold in the earth that could provide concealment. The men were skilled, but they were strangers here, fighting on ground that belonged to her. The third man lasted 10 minutes before Dorothy's patience wore thin. She appeared behind him like a ghost, the colt speaking once before he could turn. His body fell across the snow, steam rising from the wound in the cold air. That left the team leader crouched behind a fallen log, his rifle trained on shadows. Dorothy could have killed him from a dozen different positions, could have ended it quickly and quietly. But she wanted answers first. She appeared 20 feet away, stepping out of the darkness like a figure from nightmare. The mercenary spun toward her, rifle swinging around, but Dorothy's Colt was already trained on his chest. "Do not," she said quietly. The man froze, professional instincts warring with survival. He was fast, skilled, experienced. But Dorothy Reyes was legend, and legends did not miss at 20 feet. "Who sent you?" Dorothy asked. The mercenary smiled coldly. "You know I cannot tell you that." Dorothy nodded, understanding. Professional courtesy, even between enemies. She respected that, even as she prepared to kill him. But then the man surprised her. "My employer wants to meet with you," he said. "Discuss terms." "What terms?" "Purchase of your property. Fair market value plus compensation for your troubles." Dorothy almost laughed. Someone was offering to buy her land after sending killers to her door. The audacity was almost admirable. "And if I refuse, then more teams will come. Better equipped, better trained. Eventually one will succeed." Dorothy considered this, studying the man's face in the starlight. He was telling the truth, she realized. This was not personal, not revenge for Mitchell's death. This was business, cold and calculated. "Who was your employer?" The man shook his head. "That information comes with the meeting." Dorothy made her decision. She lowered her weapon slightly, enough to show she was listening. "Where and when, tomorrow night?" "The old mine shaft above Copper Creek." "Come alone, and we talk. Bring backup, and the war starts in earnest." Dorothy nodded. She would go to this meeting, face whatever corporate interests thought they could buy her out or drive her off. But she would go prepared, and she would go as Dorothy Reyes, not as some frightened widow. The mercenary stood slowly, keeping his hands visible. "You are making the right choice," he said. "We will see," Dorothy replied. The man gathered his gear and melted back into the darkness, leaving Dorothy alone with 3 bodies and a dozen new questions. Someone with serious resources wanted her land, wanted it badly enough to hire professional killers. But they had made the same mistake as Kenneth Mitchell, underestimating what they were dealing with. Dorothy Reyes had chosen peace, but peace was not the same as surrender, and anyone who thought otherwise was about to learn the difference. The old mine shaft sat like a wound in the mountainside, timber supports dark against the snow. Dorothy approached on foot, having left Thunder tied a half-mile down the trail. The meeting was set for midnight, but she had arrived 2 hours early to study the ground, to understand the tactical situation before walking into what could easily be a trap. The mine had been abandoned for 15 years, played out and dangerous, but the structures remained solid, providing cover and concealment for anyone who wanted to stage an ambush. Dorothy moved through the shadows, cataloging sight lines and escape routes, preparing for violence, even as she hoped for answers. At 5 minutes before midnight, a single rider approached up the mountain trail. Dorothy watched from concealment as a woman dismounted near the mine entrance, her movements confident and unhurried. She was perhaps 50 years old, silver hair pulled back severely, wearing expensive clothes that seemed out of place in the wilderness. The woman stood in the moonlight, hands clasped behind her back, waiting with the patience of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Dorothy studied her for several minutes, looking for weapons, for backup, for any sign this was not what it appeared to be. Finally, she stepped out of the shadows. The woman turned toward her without surprise, as if she had known exactly where Dorothy was hiding. Her smile was cold and professional, the expression of someone who had built an empire through careful calculation and ruthless execution. "Dorothy Reyes," the woman said, "you are exactly what I expected." "And you are?" Sandra Martinez. I own the Consolidated Mining Company, among other interests. Dorothy had heard of Consolidated, a corporation that had been buying up mineral rights throughout the territory. They operated with the kind of efficiency that came from unlimited resources and flexible morality. You sent killers to my home, Dorothy said. I sent negotiators, Martinez replied. The fact that you killed them all suggests we need to adjust our approach. Dorothy almost smiled. Negotiators. That was one way to describe armed mercenaries creeping through her property in the dead of night. What do you want, Martinez? Your land, specifically the mineral rights to the ridge above your cabin. There are no minerals up there. I have been over every inch of that ground. Martinez smiled. Not minerals in the traditional sense, but there is something there worth more than gold. She reached into her coat, moving slowly to avoid triggering Dorothy's defensive instincts. What she withdrew was a leather portfolio thick with papers and surveys. Coal, Martinez said, opening the portfolio. A vein that runs for miles through these mountains, enough to power half the territory for the next 50 years. Dorothy studied the geological surveys, the corporate projections, the maps marked with proposed mining operations. The numbers were staggering, millions of dollars in potential profit. Her quiet valley would become an industrial site, her mountains stripped and scarred in the name of progress. And if I refuse to sell, Martinez closed the portfolio. Then we find other ways to acquire what we need. Eminent domain, perhaps, or unfortunate accidents that leave property without owners. The threat was delivered with corporate politeness, but the meaning was clear. Dorothy could sell willingly, or she could die, and they would take it anyway. You killed 5 of my men in that canyon, Martinez continued. Professional soldiers, expensive to replace. I am offering you fair compensation for that inconvenience. Dorothy felt something cold settle in her chest. Fair compensation for defending her own land, for protecting what was hers. The audacity was breathtaking. How much? $100,000. Cash. More money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. It was a fortune, enough to buy a ranch in California, to live comfortably for the rest of her days. But Dorothy was not thinking about money. She was thinking about Samuel, about the life they had built together in these mountains, about thunder running free in pastures that had never known the sound of industrial machinery. And if I take your money and leave, then you disappear. New identity, new life, far from here. We never speak of this again. Dorothy nodded slowly as if considering the offer. Martinez smiled, thinking she had won, thinking that everyone had a price and she had found Dorothy's. She was wrong. I have a counteroffer, Dorothy said. Martinez raised an eyebrow. I am listening. You leave my valley. You take your surveys and your money and your threats, and you never come back. In exchange, I let you live. The corporate smile faded from Martinez's face. You are making a mistake, Dorothy. I have resources you cannot imagine. Men, money, political connections. You are one woman with a gun. I am Dorothy Reyes, Dorothy said quietly, and I do not miss. The 2 women faced each other in the moonlight, representatives of 2 different worlds. Martinez represented progress, industry, the inexorable march of civilization across the frontier. Dorothy represented something older, the right of individuals to defend what was theirs, to choose their own fate. The standoff stretched between them like a taut wire. Finally, Martinez stepped back. You have 24 hours to reconsider. After that, the offer is withdrawn and we proceed with other methods. She mounted her horse and rode away, leaving Dorothy alone beside the abandoned mine. But Dorothy knew this was not over. Martinez had not built an empire by accepting refusal gracefully. The real war was just beginning. Dorothy made her way back to Thunder and rode home through the darkness, her mind already working on defensive preparations. Martinez had resources, professional soldiers, political connections, but Dorothy had something more valuable in these mountains. She had home field advantage. The next morning brought visitors to Dorothy's cabin. Not corporate mercenaries this time, but neighbors. Cheryl Watson from the trading post, Gloria Brown who ran the small school, Carl Lee who had survived the canyon fight and spread word of what Dorothy really was. We heard about the meeting, Cheryl said without preamble, about what Martinez wants. Word travels fast, Dorothy replied. Fast enough, Gloria added, and we have been talking. Dorothy studied the small group, seeing determination in their faces. These were frontier people, hardened by isolation and necessity, united by the understanding that they had to protect their own. Martinez has been making offers throughout the valley, Cheryl explained, buying up land, pushing out families who have been here for generations. Those who refuse to sell have accidents, Carl Lee added grimly. Barn fires, missing livestock. Worse. Dorothy nodded. She had suspected as much. Consolidated mining did not operate through legal channels alone. What do you want from me? Dorothy asked. Help, Gloria said simply. You are the only one with the skills to fight them. I am retired. You came out of retirement for a horse, Cheryl pointed out. What about for your neighbors? Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, watching thunder move through the corral. She had chosen peace, chosen to leave the badge behind. But peace was not possible when wolves circled the flock. What did you have in mind? Dorothy asked finally. A message, Carl Lee said. Something that makes Martinez understand the cost of staying in our valley. Dorothy smiled grimly. She knew exactly what kind of message would get Sandra Martinez's attention. That night, Dorothy rode out alone, not to the meeting place this time, but to the consolidated mining camp established at the mouth of the valley. 20 men, professional security, armed and dangerous. They had set up with military precision, believing their numbers and equipment made them untouchable. They were about to learn otherwise. Dorothy approached through the darkness, moving with the silent grace of a natural hunter. The camp was well guarded, sentries posted at regular intervals, but they were watching for conventional threats. They were not prepared for Dorothy Reyes. She took the first sentry with her knife, quick and silent. The second died before he could raise an alarm. Dorothy shot from the darkness, taking him clean. By the time the camp realized they were under attack, she had already melted back into the shadows. The remaining guards scrambled for defensive positions, but they were fighting an enemy they could not see, could not track, could not predict. Dorothy struck from the darkness like winter wind, appearing long enough to kill, then vanishing before return of fire could find her. The siege of the mining camp lasted until dawn. Dorothy picked off sentries, sabotaged equipment, and generally made life miserable for the professional soldiers who thought they owned her valley. By morning, half their number were dead or wounded, and the survivors were jumping at shadows. Sandra Martinez arrived with the sunrise, her face cold with fury as she surveyed the destruction. Dorothy watched from the ridge above, the Sharp's rifle steady in her hands. One shot would end it all, would remove the corporate threat permanently, but Dorothy was not an assassin. She was a lawwoman, and lawwomen gave warnings before they delivered justice. The shot echoed across the valley, the heavy bullet striking the ground 6 inches from Martinez's feet. The corporate executive dove for cover, her composure finally cracking. When she looked up at the ridge, Dorothy was gone. But the message was clear. Sandra Martinez was in Dorothy's sights, and the next shot would not miss. The corporate's team packed up and left that afternoon, their confidence shattered by a night of terror. But Dorothy knew they would be back, with more men, better equipment, and a personal grudge against the woman who had humiliated them. She spent the following days preparing, turning her valley into a fortress. Old skills returned like muscle memory, the lessons of 20 years spent hunting desperate men. She cached weapons and supplies, prepared fallback positions, and turned every trail into a potential killing ground. The neighbors helped, understanding that their fate was tied to hers. Cheryl Wasson provided ammunition and supplies from her trading post. Gloria Brown used her schoolhouse as a communication center, coordinating with other settlements throughout the territory. Carl Lee, despite his earlier terror, proved surprisingly useful as a scout and messenger. Word of the conflict spread beyond the valley, carried by traveling merchants and circuit riders. The story grew in the telling, becoming legend. Dorothy Reyes, the famous marshal, had come out of retirement to fight a corporate army. David against Goliath played out in the Colorado mountains. Some said she was crazy, that no one could stand against consolidated mining's resources. Others remembered the old stories, the reputation that had made her the most feared lawman in the territory. They began to drift toward the valley, drawn by curiosity or old loyalty or simple human decency. Ryan Hill arrived on a cold morning, riding a scarred horse and wearing the remnants of a cavalry uniform. Dorothy recognized him immediately, though 15 years had added gray to his hair and lines to his face. Lieutenant Ryan Hill, former Army scout, the man who had taught her to track in the early days of her career. "Heard you might need some help," Hill said without preamble. "I thought you were dead," Dorothy replied. "Might as well be. Wife died, kids grown and gone. Nothing left but old skills and older memories." Dorothy studied her former mentor, seeing the same restless energy that had made him legendary in military circles. Ryan Hill could track a ghost through solid rock, could read sign that others could not even see. If Sandra Martinez wanted to play games in the wilderness, she would find herself outmatched. "Welcome home," Dorothy said. Others followed. Charles Lopez, the gunfighter Dorothy had wounded in Mitchell's camp, arrived with his hands still bandaged but his loyalty absolute. He had seen what Dorothy could do, understood what she represented. In a territory where might made right, Dorothy Reyes stood for something better. Ralph Garcia came next, a former deputy who had served under Dorothy years ago. He brought news from the territorial capital, political intelligence about Consolidated Mining's operations. The corporation had friends in high places, judges and politicians bought and paid for. But they also had enemies, competitors who would be happy to see them fail. By the end of the week, Dorothy had a small army of volunteers, not professional soldiers, but frontier fighters who knew the country and understood the stakes. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy with unlimited resources. But they had Dorothy Reyes. Sandra Martinez returned with 50 men and a personal grudge. Professional mercenaries this time, veterans of corporate wars fought in distant territories. They set up camp at the valley mouth and began systematic operations, cutting off supply lines, isolating the defenders, applying pressure with military precision. But they made the same mistake Kenneth Mitchell had made. They underestimated the ground they were fighting on, and they underestimated the woman who owned it. Dorothy struck first, hitting their supply convoy as it wound through the narrow canyon. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, coordinated with the precision of a military operation. Ryan Hill led the flanking movement, using his cavalry training to devastating effect. Charles Lopez provided covering fire with his rifle, picking off targets with professional skill. Ralph Garcia coordinated the withdrawal, ensuring no one was left behind. The convoy was destroyed, 20 men dead or wounded, supplies scattered across the canyon floor. Sandra Martinez's professional army had been bloodied by frontier fighters who knew how to use the terrain. But Martinez was not finished. She had resources Dorothy could barely imagine, connections that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. If she could not win through military force, she would use legal and political pressure. The territorial marshal arrived 3 days later, backed by a company of federal troops. Dorothy watched them approach from her cabin porch, understanding that the game had changed. This was no longer a private war between herself and a corporation. This had become a matter of territorial law. Marshal William Hayes dismounted carefully, keeping his hands visible. He knew Dorothy's reputation, understood what kind of woman he was dealing with. But he also had his orders. "Dorothy," Hayes said formally, "I have a warrant for your arrest. On what charges? Murder, destruction of property, armed resistance to lawful authority." Dorothy almost laughed. Lawful authority, as if Sandra Martinez represented anything more than corporate greed wrapped in legal documents. "And if I refuse to surrender?" Hayes gestured toward the federal troops. "Then this becomes a siege, and people die who do not deserve to." Dorothy studied the marshal, seeing a good man caught between duty and justice. Hayes had always been honest, had tried to keep order in a territory too large for any one lawman to control. But he was also a federal employee, subject to political pressure from Washington. "I want to see the warrant," Dorothy said. Hayes handed over the legal documents, his face carefully neutral. Dorothy read them slowly, noting the signatures, the official seals, the careful legal language that made her defense of her own land into criminal activity. But she also noted something else. The warrant was signed by Judge Harrison Webb, a man she knew to be in Consolidated Mining's pocket. The charges were filed by Sandra Martinez herself, claiming to represent the territorial government. "This is corporate law, not territorial law," Dorothy said finally. "The warrant is legal and binding," Hayes replied, but his tone suggested he understood the distinction. Dorothy made her decision. She would not resist federal authority, would not start a war that could only end in bloodshed. But she would not surrender to corporate justice either. I will come with you, Marshal, Dorothy said. But I want a territorial trial, not a corporate kangaroo court. Hayes nodded, understanding. That can be arranged. Dorothy gathered her personal effects, including the badge and gun that had defined her former life. As she prepared to leave, her neighbors gathered on the porch, their faces grim with understanding. This is not over, Cheryl Watson said quietly. No, Dorothy agreed, it is not. She mounted Thunder and rode away with the federal troops, leaving her valley in the hands of friends who would continue the fight in her absence. But as they descended toward the territorial capital, Dorothy was already planning her next move. Sandra Martinez thought she had won, thought that legal maneuvering would accomplish what military force had failed to achieve. But Dorothy Reyes had spent 20 years working within the territorial legal system, understood its strengths and weaknesses better than any corporate lawyer. The trial would be interesting. The territorial courthouse in Denver was packed to overflowing, spectators drawn by the legend of Dorothy Reyes and the drama of her conflict with Consolidated Mining. Outside, newspaper reporters from as far away as San Francisco waited for statements, understanding that this trial would determine the future of corporate expansion in the Western Territories. Dorothy sat in the defendant's chair, wearing the same practical clothes she had worn in the mountains. No attempt at legal theater, no effort to appear sympathetic. She was what she was, a frontier woman who had defended her land against corporate aggression. Sandra Martinez sat in the gallery, her expensive lawyer beside her, confident that money and influence would prevail over frontier justice. She had bought judges before, had used legal manipulation to acquire properties throughout the territory. This would be no different, but she had not counted on Dorothy's choice of legal representation. Judge Harrison Webb called the court to order, his face carefully neutral despite the substantial payments he had received from Consolidated Mining. The prosecution opened with a detailed account of Dorothy's crimes, painting her as a dangerous vigilante who had murdered innocent men. But when the defense rose to respond, Sandra Martinez felt the first cold touch of doubt. Dorothy's lawyer was James Morrison, former Territorial Attorney General, the man who had prosecuted more corporate criminals than anyone in the territory's history. His reputation for integrity was matched only by his skill in the courtroom, and his presence suggested that Dorothy had resources Martinez had not anticipated. Morrison opened with a simple question. Your Honor, I move that all charges be dismissed on the grounds that the prosecution lacks standing to file them. The courtroom erupted in confusion. Judge Webb gavelled for order, his face flushed with anger. On what grounds? Webb demanded. Morrison smiled. On the grounds that Miss Martinez does not represent the territorial government, despite her claims. She is a private citizen seeking to use the courts to settle a commercial dispute. The prosecutor objected, but Morrison was ready with documentation. Corporate filings, territorial records, federal surveys that prove Consolidated Mining had no legal claim to Dorothy's land. Martinez had been operating through legal fiction, using bought judges and political pressure to acquire properties that were not legally available. But Morrison was not finished. He called his first witness, a mild-mannered clerk from the Territorial Land Office. Under questioning, the man revealed that Consolidated Mining had been filing fraudulent claims throughout the territory, using forged documents and bribed officials to steal land from legitimate owners. The second witness was a federal surveyor who testified that the mineral surveys Martinez had shown Dorothy were fabricated. There was no coal on her land, no valuable minerals worth mining. The entire operation was a land grab, designed to acquire property for speculation rather than development. By the end of the first day, Sandra Martinez's legal case was in ruins. But Dorothy knew the real fight was just beginning. Corporate interests did not surrender easily, and Martinez had too much invested to walk away quietly. That night, as Dorothy sat in her hotel room under federal guard, Morrison explained the larger picture. This is bigger than your land, Dorothy. Martinez represents a new kind of threat. Corporations that operate outside traditional law. They buy judges, bribe officials, use legal manipulation to steal what they cannot acquire legitimately. And you think this trial can stop them? Morrison smiled grimly. This trial can expose them. Once people understand how the system is being corrupted, they can fight back. The second day brought new revelations. Morrison called a parade of witnesses, territorial officials who testified about corporate bribery, judges who had been approached with offers they could not refuse, politicians who had been bought and sold like commodities. Judge Webb tried to control the proceedings, but Morrison was relentless. Each witness added another piece to the puzzle, revealing the scope of Consolidated Mining's corruption. By afternoon, it was clear that the trial had become something larger than a simple criminal case. It had become an indictment of corporate power itself. Sandra Martinez sat in the gallery, her face pale with rage and fear. Everything she had built, every connection she had cultivated, was being exposed in open court. The carefully constructed network of corruption was unraveling before her eyes. On the third day, Dorothy took the stand in her own defense. Morrison led her through the events step by step, from Kenneth Mitchell's theft of her horse to the siege of the mining camp. Dorothy's testimony was clear and factual, delivered in the calm voice of a professional law woman reporting on a case. But when the prosecutor cross-examined her, Dorothy's responses carried the weight of absolute conviction. "You killed 5 men in that canyon," the prosecutor said. "I defended my property against armed thieves," Dorothy replied. "You destroyed corporate equipment worth thousands of dollars. I stopped criminals from operating on my land. You resisted lawful authority. I resisted corporate thugs who had no legal right to be there." The exchange continued for hours, but Dorothy never wavered. She had done what any frontier citizen had the right to do, defended her property against criminal aggression. The fact that the criminals wore corporate badges made no difference under territorial law. Morrison's closing argument was masterful, weaving together the evidence of corruption with the fundamental principles of frontier justice. Dorothy Reyes had not committed crimes, he argued. She had enforced the law when official authority failed to do so. But it was Dorothy's own words that sealed the case. Rising from the defendant's chair, she faced the packed courtroom with the calm dignity that had made her legendary. "I am Dorothy Reyes," she said simply. "For 20 years, I wore a badge and enforced the law in this territory. I brought in murderers and thieves, protected the innocent, upheld justice when others would not." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I retired from that life to marry Samuel and build a home in the mountains. I chose peace over violence, love over law. But when criminals came to my land, when they threatened what I had built with my own hands, I remembered who I was." Her voice carried clearly through the silent courtroom. "Sandra Martinez and her corporation represent everything I fought against as a marshal. They use money instead of guns, lawyers instead of bullets, but they are criminals just the same. They steal land, corrupt officials, and destroy lives for profit." Dorothy's eyes found Martinez in the gallery. "I gave them fair warning. I offered them the chance to leave peacefully. They chose violence instead. So I gave them violence, professional and final." She turned back to the judge. "I am not sorry for what I did. I would do it again tomorrow if necessary. This is still the frontier, Your Honor. Out here, people protect what is theirs, and justice comes from the barrel of a gun when the law fails to provide it." Dorothy sat down to thunderous applause from the gallery. Judge Webb gavelled for order, but the damage was done. The courtroom had heard the voice of frontier justice, and it rang truer than any corporate lawyer's argument. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Not guilty on all charges. Sandra Martinez fled the courthouse as the verdict was announced, her empire of corruption crumbling around her. Federal investigators, alerted by the trial testimony, began examining Consolidated Mining's operations throughout the territory. Within a month, the corporation was dissolved, its assets seized, its officials facing criminal charges. Dorothy rode home to her valley a free woman, but more than that, a vindicated one. The trial had established a precedent that would protect frontier landowners for generations to come. Corporate power could not simply steamroll over individual rights, not when those individuals were willing to fight back. But the real victory was smaller, more personal. Dorothy returned to her cabin, to thunder waiting in the corral, to the life she had chosen and defended. The mountains were still hers, the peace she had built with Samuel intact. She hung up her gun and badge, but did not hide them. The frontier still needed Dorothy Reyes, and she would be ready when called upon. The legend lived on. Spring came early to the valley that year, snow melting from the high peaks to reveal green grass and wildflowers. Dorothy worked in her garden, planting vegetables that would feed her through the coming winter, her hands dark with rich mountain soil. Thunder grazed nearby, his black coat gleaming in the morning sun. 6 months had passed since the trial, 6 months of blessed quiet. The territorial newspapers had moved on to other stories, the legend of Dorothy Reyes settling into frontier folklore. She was content with that, happy to return to the anonymity she had chosen when she married Samuel. But the frontier had a way of finding Dorothy Reyes, even when she tried to hide from it. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning when Cheryl Watson rode up from the trading post with news from the territorial capital. Dorothy set down her hoe and walked to the fence, reading concern in her neighbor's face. Federal marshals were asking questions, Cheryl said without preamble. About you, about what happened with Martinez. Dorothy frowned. The trial was over. The case closed. Sandra Martinez was in federal prison, her corporation dissolved. What more could there be? They are not asking about Martinez, Cheryl continued. They are asking about before, about the old cases, the men you brought in during your marshal days. Dorothy felt something cold settle in her stomach. Her 20-year career had involved dozens of cases, hundreds of arrests, countless enemies who might harbor grudges. She had always known that retirement might not protect her from the past. What kind of questions? About the Dalton gang specifically? About what happened to the money they stole? Dorothy nodded slowly. The Dalton case had been her most famous success, the arrest that had made her reputation throughout the territory. But it had also been her most complicated, involving political corruption and missing funds that were never recovered. How much do they know? Enough to be asking questions. Cheryl's face was grim. Dorothy, there are rumors that some of that money ended up in private hands, that maybe the gang had help from someone in law enforcement. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Dorothy had heard the rumors before, whispers that followed every major arrest, every successful prosecution. When large amounts of money disappeared, people always suspected the lawmen who handled the case. But in this instance, the rumors were true, not in the way people thought, not through corruption or criminal conspiracy. But Dorothy had indeed taken money from the Dalton gang, money that rightfully belonged to the banks they had robbed. She had taken it for the best of reasons, but she had taken it nonetheless. The story went back 15 years, to a cold winter when Dorothy had tracked the Dalton gang through 3 territories. She had finally cornered them in a box canyon, much like the one where Kenneth Mitchell had died. But instead of a gunfight, she had found something unexpected. The gang had been caring for a group of children, orphans whose parents had died in a typhoid outbreak. The Daltons were killers and thieves, but they were also trying to keep 8 children alive through a brutal winter. The money they had stolen was being used to buy food, medicine, supplies. Dorothy had faced an impossible choice: arrest the gang and let the children starve, or find another way. She had chosen a third option, one that had haunted her ever since. She had made a deal with the Daltons. They would surrender peacefully, serve their time, and the children would be cared for. But the stolen money, instead of being returned to banks that would never miss it, would go to establish an orphanage in the territorial capital. It had worked perfectly. The Daltons were arrested, tried, and sentenced. The children were saved, the orphanage established. Justice was served after a fashion, and Dorothy's reputation was made. But she had falsified the paperwork, had reported the money as never recovered. Technically, she had committed a federal crime, theft of evidence in a criminal case. The fact that the money had gone to a good cause would not matter to a federal prosecutor. Now, 15 years later, someone was asking questions. Dorothy walked back to her cabin, her mind working through the implications. If federal investigators were looking into the Dalton case, they would eventually uncover the truth. Bank records, orphanage funding, witness testimony, all the threads that could unravel her carefully constructed lie. She could run, disappear into the wilderness with a new identity. She had the skills, the connections, the resources. But running would mean abandoning everything she had built, the life she had chosen, the valley that was her home. Or she could stay and fight, use the reputation she had earned to defend the choices she had made. But fighting meant risking everything, including the freedom she had won in the Martinez trial. Dorothy made her choice the way she always had, quickly and without regret. She would stay. That evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Dorothy saw riders approaching up the valley trail. 3 men, riding with the careful precision of federal lawmen. She recognized their leader immediately, Marshal William Hayes, the man who had arrested her for the Martinez affair. Hayes dismounted carefully, his face grave with official duty. But Dorothy could see something else in his expression, reluctance mixed with professional obligation. "Dorothy," Hayes said formally, "we need to talk." "About the Dalton case," Dorothy replied. It was not a question. Hayes nodded. "Federal investigators have been reviewing old files, looking for patterns of corruption. Your name came up in connection with missing funds. How much do they know?" "Enough to ask questions." "Not enough to file charges yet." Dorothy gestured to the porch steps, and Hayes settled himself carefully. His deputies remained mounted, hands near their weapons, but not threatening. Professional caution when dealing with Dorothy Reyes. "What do you want from me, Marshal?" "The truth," Hayes said simply. "What happened to the Dalton money?" Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, watching Thunder move through the corral. The stallion was older now, silver beginning to thread through his black mane, but still magnificent. Like her, he had earned his peace. "The money went to the children," Dorothy said finally. "The orphans the Daltons were protecting?" Hayes nodded slowly. He had suspected as much, had known Dorothy too long to believe she would steal for personal gain. "Can you prove that?" Dorothy smiled grimly. "Every penny is accounted for. Orphanage records, bank deposits, witness statements. I kept detailed documentation just in case this day came. Then why not report it officially? Why falsify the paperwork? Because federal law does not recognize necessity as a defense for theft. The banks would have demanded their money back. The children would have died, and the orphanage would never have been built." Hayes understood. Dorothy had bent the law to serve justice, had chosen human lives over legal technicalities. It was the kind of decision that made her legendary among frontier lawmen and potentially criminal under federal statute. "The investigators want you to come in voluntarily," Hayes said. "Answer questions, provide documentation, clear this up officially. And if I refuse, then they will issue a warrant and send federal marshals to arrest you. This valley will become a battleground again." Dorothy nodded. She had expected as much. Federal bureaucrats did not understand frontier justice, did not recognize the gray areas where law and necessity intersected. They wanted clear answers, simple categories, black and white solutions to problems that existed in shades of gray. "When do they want me?" "Tomorrow, in Denver." Dorothy stood, decision made. She would go to Denver, would face the federal investigators, would tell them the truth about the Dalton money. But she would go as Dorothy Reyes, not as some apologetic criminal seeking mercy. "I will need tonight to prepare," Dorothy said. Hayes nodded. "We will escort you in the morning." After the federal marshals made camp down the valley, Dorothy spent the evening putting her affairs in order. She wrote letters to her neighbors, instructions for caring for Thunder, arrangements for the cabin and land. If the federal government decided to prosecute her, she wanted to ensure her valley would be protected. But as she worked, Dorothy felt a familiar calm settling over her. She had faced worse odds than federal prosecutors, had survived challenges that would have broken lesser people. Whatever came next, she would meet it with the same steady courage that had defined her career. The truth was on her side, and Dorothy Reyes had never lost when truth was her ally. The federal building in Denver was a monument to bureaucratic power, all marble columns and official seals designed to intimidate citizens seeking justice. Dorothy walked through the corridors with the same calm confidence she had shown in frontier courtrooms, her documentation organized in a leather portfolio, her story ready to be told. The lead investigator was a thin man named Robert Sterling, a career federal prosecutor who had built his reputation on exposing corruption in territorial governments. He studied Dorothy across a polished conference table, clearly expecting to find another corrupt lawman who had enriched herself at public expense. He was about to be disappointed. "Miss Reyes," Sterling began formally, "we are investigating irregularities in the Dalton gang case from 1878, specifically the disposition of stolen funds that were never recovered." "The money was recovered," Dorothy replied calmly. "All of it." Sterling frowned, consulting his files. "There is no record of recovery. Your official report states that the funds were never located." "My official report was incomplete," Dorothy said, "but not inaccurate." She opened her portfolio and spread documents across the table. Bank records, orphanage receipts, witness statements, a paper trail that accounted for every stolen dollar. The money went to establish the Territorial Children's Home in Denver, Dorothy explained. It has been operating for 15 years, caring for orphans and abandoned children throughout the territory. Sterling studied the documents, his frown deepening. Even if this is true, it does not excuse the falsification of official records. You committed federal crimes, Miss Reyes. I saved 8 children from starvation, Dorothy replied. If is a federal crime, then federal law needs to be changed. The interrogation continued for hours, Sterling trying to find evidence of personal corruption, while Dorothy methodically demolished his assumptions. She had not stolen the money for herself, had not profited from her deception, had acted solely to protect innocent lives. But federal law was clear. Theft of evidence was a crime regardless of motivation. Falsification of official records was a crime, regardless of outcome. Dorothy had violated federal statutes, and Sterling intended to prosecute. That afternoon, as Dorothy sat in a federal holding cell awaiting formal charges, she received an unexpected visitor. James Morrison, the lawyer who had defended her in the Martinez trial, arrived with news that changed everything. The Territorial Children's Home is being investigated, Morrison said without preamble. Federal auditors are examining their funding, their operations, their legal status. Dorothy felt ice in her veins. If the federal government shut down the orphanage, dozens of children would be left without care, without shelter, without hope. Can they do that? Morrison nodded grimly. If they can prove the orphanage was established with stolen funds, they can seize all assets, dissolve the institution, scatter the children to other facilities. Dorothy closed her eyes, seeing the faces of the children she had tried to protect 15 years ago. They were adults now, but there were new orphans, new children who depended on the home she had helped create. What can we do? Morrison smiled. We fight, just like we did with Martinez. The legal battle that followed made the Martinez trial look simple by comparison. Federal prosecutors argued that Dorothy's theft, however well-intentioned, had tainted everything that followed. The orphanage was built on criminal proceeds, they claimed, and must be dissolved. But Morrison had assembled a formidable defense. Character witnesses testified to Dorothy's integrity, to her 20-year record of service. Former orphans, now adults, spoke about the home that had saved their lives. Community leaders explained how the institution had become a cornerstone of territorial social services. The key witness was unexpected. Thomas Dalton, the surviving member of the gang Dorothy had arrested, testified from federal prison about the circumstances of his surrender. She could have killed us all, Dalton said from the witness stand. We were cornered, outgunned, facing Dorothy Reyes in our own territory. But she saw the children, understood what was at stake. He looked directly at the federal prosecutors. Dorothy Reyes gave us a choice. Die fighting and let the children starve, or surrender and let them live. We chose life, for them and for us. If that makes her a criminal, then the law is wrong. But the most powerful testimony came from Dorothy herself. Taking the stand in her own defense, she spoke with the quiet authority that had made her legendary. I have spent my life enforcing the law, Dorothy said. But law without justice is just organized tyranny. When federal statutes conflict with the human decency, when legal technicalities threaten innocent lives, then lawmen must choose between their badges and their consciences. She faced the federal prosecutors directly. I chose conscience. I chose life over law, children over regulations, human decency over bureaucratic procedure. If that makes me a criminal, then I am proud to be one. The trial lasted 2 weeks, capturing national attention as newspapers across the country followed the story of the frontier marshal who had bent federal law to save orphaned children. Public opinion swung heavily in Dorothy's favor, with editorials demanding that common sense prevail over legal technicalities. But federal law was federal law, and the prosecutors had a strong case. Dorothy had committed the crime she was accused of, regardless of her motivations. Justice and law were not always the same thing. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the foreman's voice carried clearly through the packed courtroom. On the charge of theft of federal evidence, we find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom erupted in cheers. Dorothy remained calm, but Morrison could see relief in her eyes. On the charge of falsification of official records, we find the defendant not guilty. More cheers, louder now. Federal prosecutors sat in stunned silence, their carefully constructed case demolished by 12 citizens who understood the difference between law and justice. The judge gavelled for order, then addressed Dorothy directly. Miss Reyes, this court finds that while your actions technically violated federal statutes, they were taken in extraordinary circumstances to prevent greater harm. The jury has spoken, and this court agrees. You are free to go. Dorothy stood, her face calm but her heart racing. She had won again, had survived another challenge to the life she had chosen. But more importantly, the orphanage was safe, the children protected, the good work allowed to continue. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around Dorothy, seeking statements about her victory. But she had little to say, only that justice had been served and innocent children would continue to be cared for. That evening, as she prepared to return to her valley, Dorothy received one final visitor. Robert Sterling, the federal prosecutor who had tried to convict her, appeared at her hotel room door. I want you to know, Sterling said quietly, that I respect what you did, not legally, but morally. Dorothy nodded. The law is important, Mr. Sterling, but it is not more important than human life. Sterling smiled ruefully. I spent my career believing that law and justice were the same thing. You have shown me they are not. He turned to leave, then paused. For what it is worth, Miss Reyes, I think you made the right choice. 15 years ago and today. Dorothy returned to her valley the next morning, riding thunder through mountain passes still touched with snow. The cabin looked exactly as she had left it, peaceful and isolated, surrounded by the wilderness she had chosen as her home. But something had changed during her absence. News of her trial had spread throughout the territory, carried by newspapers and word of mouth. The legend of Dorothy Reyes had grown again, not as a gunfighter or lawman, but as a woman who had stood up to federal authority in defense of innocent children. Visitors began arriving within days of her return, former colleagues seeking advice, territorial officials requesting consultation, citizens with problems that required someone with Dorothy's unique skills. The quiet retirement she had sought seemed more elusive than ever. But Dorothy did not mind. She had learned something important during the federal trial, something about the relationship between law and justice, between individual conscience and institutional authority. The frontier still needed Dorothy Reyes, not as a marshal or gunfighter, but as a voice of moral clarity in an increasingly complex world. She would answer that call, as she always had, with courage and conviction and an unwavering commitment to what was right. The legend lived on, but it had evolved. Dorothy Reyes was no longer just the fastest gun or the best tracker in the territory. She had become something more important, something the frontier desperately needed. She had become conscience with a badge, justice with a human face, law tempered by wisdom and mercy. And in her quiet valley, surrounded by mountains that had witnessed her struggles and victories, Dorothy Reyes prepared for whatever challenges the future might bring. The frontier was changing, but some things remained constant. Truth, justice, courage, and the willingness to stand up for what was right, regardless of the cost. Those were the values Dorothy Reyes represented, the principles she had lived by for 40 years. They had made her legendary, had carried her through trials and triumphs, had defined her life and shaped her legacy. And they would continue to guide her, whatever came next, for as long as the frontier needed Dorothy Reyes. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the valley gold and crimson. Thunder grazed peacefully in the corral, content in his home. Dorothy sat on her porch, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new opportunities to serve justice in a world that often seemed to have forgotten what justice meant. But tonight there was peace in the valley, and Dorothy Reyes was home. The legend would continue, but the woman behind it had found something more valuable than fame or reputation. She had found purpose, and that was enough.